So Oliver Stone and I put out Untold History of the United States, the documentary series on Showtime and now Netflix, and a series of books, big book, and the concise Untold History based on the documentary narratives, then 2 volumes of young readers' books. We've got a graphic novel on the way. But so that came out in late 2012, early 2013. And then we just put out the new edition of the book. So the new edition is more than 900 pages. We added 160 pages, mostly on the Trump administration. And we've looked at how the world has changed from late 2012, when we came out with the original project, to now. How much more dangerous the world has become. Think back to late 2012. The hands of the doomsday clock were 8 minutes before midnight. Right, that's pretty scary, 8 minutes before midnight. But now we're at, as everybody here knows, 2 minutes before midnight. Back in 2012, when Mitt Romney said that the main security threat facing the United States was Russia, Obama said the 1980s is looking for its foreign policy again, wants its foreign policy to come back again. Obama attacked Romney for saying that Russia was a threat to the United States in 2012. But if we look at what's gone on since then, I mean, the hands of the doomsday clock have moved. So that was January 2018. Also January 2018, Secretary of Defense Mattis has said that international terrorism is no longer America's main threat, security threat. He said it was now Russia and China. In February 2018, Trump came out with his new nuclear posture review. One thing after another. But what I want to point to is what happened on March 1st, 2018. That's when Putin gave his State of the Nation address. And in that address, he talked about what's happened. He talked about how the U.S. pulling out of the ABM Treaty in 2002 was a major game changer. And he said that now, that because of that in part, and because of the spread of America's missile defense, the United States, that Russia has now developed 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent America's missile defense. 5 new nuclear weapons: hypersonic glide vehicles, nuclear-armed, nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, nuclear torpedoes that can blow up coastal cities, make them uninhabitable for centuries probably. He threw down the gauntlet there. And he said, you didn't listen to us, but you better listen to us now. So the question is that Jeremy and I are grappling with in part, what's going on that's created this situation of such enmity, such hostility. The military experts said that they were shocked by what Putin said in that address. Alexander Goltz and Geese and the others said this is totally a game changer. It meant that all those tens of billions of dollars that the U.S. has spent on missile defense that we had invaded against, all of us, for decades, were now totally wasted. They were no longer going to be able to defend against Russian nuclear missiles, the new generation. So, and there's been articles lately in the Times about hypersonic missiles and what a threat that they represent. So the old parameters really no longer apply for understanding the arms race, understanding how dangerous the world is now compared to what it was just 6 years ago when we came out with the book originally. We're going to get back to the question of Russiagate and the campaign. But before that, I want to trace some of this, how this has evolved. Because I think it begins in large part, well, it begins with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And in 1990, the neocon thinker Charles Krauthammer, one of the leading neocon philosophers, if you can call the neocons having philosophers, Krauthammer said, he gave his Henry Scoop Jackson Memorial Address, which was then published as an article, in which he says that this is now the unipolar moment. that the United States now is the unipolar power in the world. Nobody else can threaten the United States. And he said, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he says that the unipolar era might last for 30 to 40 years. That was followed by Hadley and Libby and Cheney and Wolfowitz getting together and came up with a plan to actually put that into effect. And it was called the Defense Planning Guidance. It was leaked by the New York Times in March of 1993. And it says the U.S. has to be prepared to fight wars against North Korea and Iran. At the same time, we can rebuff Russian incursion into Europe. They said to do this, we need to massively increase America's defense spending, build up our military again. They said we lost ground in the 1970s and 1980s, but now with Clinton, now we're going to rebuild it. It was so corrosive, so radioactive, that they were forced to walk it back. Cheney said, I'd never heard of this before. I mean, they just lied, and they walked it back. But it was during this time that the Project for a New American Century was formed. The same people who had the new defense planning guidance now formed in 1997 the Project for a New American Century. And as everybody here knows, these were the people who went into the Bush administration after the coup in 2000, and when Bush seized the White House. These people went in there and they ran foreign policy. And they brought us a series of nightmares that we're so familiar with under George W. Bush. In 2002, after the invasion of Afghanistan, in the beginning, seemed to be so successful, Charles Krauthammer wrote again. And he said, I was mistaken back in 1990. This was not the unipolar moment, it's the unipolar era. He said, it's going to last indefinitely. This could go on for a century. It could go on indefinitely into the future. And all of them was all the neocons at that point. Then they started to trot out the idea of empire. Empire was anathema. Right? The American empire started back in 1899, we could say, but they had never talked about it being an empire. Now they're all bragging about it being an empire. On January 5th, 2003, the New York Times headline is Sunday Magazine section, American Empire, get used to it. And then they all started coming out of the woodwork, and they started to say that after we take care of Afghanistan and Iraq, then we're going to have our hit list. And there were about 7 more countries on the hit list. And most of them started with Syria, and then Iran, and then Libya, and then Somalia, and they went down the line. Exactly what we've seen happening in terms of the countries that they have toppled, with the countries that they're trying to topple. But then things started to go awry. The head of the Arab League said that all hell has broken loose in Iraq. The gates of hell are open in Iraq, he said. And then by 2006, everybody knew that Bush's policies in the Middle East were a disaster. And Krauthammer writes an obituary for the American empire. He says the unipolar era is over. The unipolar moment is coming to an end. The unipolar moment is coming to an end. And that's what we saw. So we saw this a situation in which, in a multipolar world, an increasingly multipolar world, the U.S. attempt to assert unipolarity was absurd. And it was slated for failure. Conceptual failure, military failure, every way, political failure. And this was under Bush and then Obama. And so we look at it, and one of the things that Jeremy and I like to do is see how the world looks from the Russian perspective. Very, very different than it does from the American perspective. So we look at what happens so Putin takes office in 2000. On 9/11, the first country to support the U.S. after 9/11, to reach out to the United States, was Russia. Putin even allows the United States to use his bases in order to attack Afghanistan. Russia gives him permission to use the bases in Kyrgyzstan. The Americans promised we'd be in there for about a year in Kyrgyzstan. Then we decide, well, we want to stay there indefinitely. We begin to betray all of the trust that had been developed. Russians were furious, appalled by the illegal US-British invasion of Iraq. They were appalled by the overthrow in Libya. In 2006, Lieber and Press wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, the Council on Foreign Relations magazine, saying that the United States now has a first strike capability. If the United States launched the first nuclear strike against Russia and China would not be able to respond. We could wipe out both countries. The Washington Post said heads were spinning in the Kremlin. They interpreted this to mean that this was official US policy because it was Council on Foreign Relations. And so they're becoming more and more paranoid, realizing that the United States, they thought the United States would be a friendly force, would integrate them into the global system, and it was becoming more and more clear that that wasn't the case. Jeremy mentioned the expansion of NATO. If there's anything that outrages the Russians, it's the expansion of NATO. Because they promised Gorbachev, the Americans and the Brits and the Germans, promised Gorbachev in 1990 that if they allowed the reunification of Germany, then NATO would not expand one thumb's width to the east. Right from the very beginning, within months, they were planning for the expansion of NATO. That was a lie from the very beginning. And now they've expanded 13 countries to the east. Why is, and then in 2008, George W. Bush announces that the United States wants to expand to Georgia and Ukraine. We want to expand NATO to Georgia and Ukraine. This was a further outrage to the Russians. Ukraine is essential. Ukraine is essential to Russian strategy. You go back to Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard. Brzezinski wrote in 1990, and then that was doubled down on by Hadley and Libby and the others more recently. And they said that if you could deny Ukraine to Russia, then Russia will no longer be a major power. Russia's only hope for being a major power is if it still controls Ukraine. The Americans knew that. And so when they're talking about expansion of NATO to Ukraine, that was the point beyond which Russia was no longer willing to play ball. The Financial Times, so we know about the Ukraine crisis. Jeremy has talked about this, everybody here is familiar with it. But I think, let me give you a little bit more of a sense of some of this. Among those who've commented about what a terrible, destructive move this was the former senator and basketball player Bill Bradley. Bradley is actually quite smart on this. He says, talking about the NATO expansion first, he says, we kicked them when they were down, we expanded NATO. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of certain people in the Clinton administration who were irredentist East European types who believe Russia will forever be the enemy. Therefore, we've got to protect against a time when they might once be aggressive, thereby creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. He goes on and says, my feelings about the Russian thing are extremely sad. I think we've created a problem that could have been easily avoided. We've lost a partner that could have been enormously important over the long term, and in particular over the issues that most threaten us today. You might have seen that William Burns, the lifetime ambassador, former ambassador to Russia, came out with a memoir recently. Well, Burns, Chelsea Manning released certain documents. And among the documents that Chelsea Manning released were documents that Burns sent back from Moscow to Washington when the expansion was taking place, and we talked about expanding NATO to Ukraine. He wrote a confidential cable, number 182, on February 1st, 2008. The subject line was "Niet means Niet." Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. And so made very clear that the Russians would never tolerate the expansion to NATO. We know the history of the crisis there, the coup. We know the role that was played by Victoria Nuland and the neocons. We know the role that was played by Joe Biden, who was instrumental in that, who was constantly dozens and dozens and dozens of phone conversations with Yatsenyuk and Poroshenko and with the American ambassador there. he was really the one in the administration who was orchestrating this. According to the Financial Times said that the West had been trying for decades to wrest Ukraine from the Russian orbit. We have now succeeded in doing that. And they were very, very open about it. This wasn't some democratic revolution, spontaneous. We know about the right-wing militias, the neo-fascists who were involved in this operation. But the U.S. portrays it as just a black and white situation. It was actually Putin who said that Ukraine should work with both sides. But according to Financial Times, the wording of the deal that we were demanding meant that Ukraine had to only by EU laws, and the idea was to eventually get them into NATO. So the situation is worsening. One of the more interesting recent comments, to bring this back to Russiagate, was by Ben Rhodes, Obama's foreign policy advisor. And Ben, in his memoir recently, said the Maidan shifted a gear. He says, after that, Putin went on the offensive after the Maidan. He said the gloves were off in a way. To Putin, Ukraine was such a part of Russia that he took it as an assault on him. And in his memoir, he writes, Putin, I think, interpreted the protests that ousted the Ukrainian president as the Americans coming into Russia. He thought we were behind those protests. He drew no distinction between Ukraine and Russia. I'd sit in the Oval Office and listen to these endless conversations where Putin would steer everything back to his view that we had overthrown a democratically elected government in Yanukovych. He was going to punch back. That's when we started to see fake news. We started to see the release of intercepted communications to suit Russia's political narratives. So all of that set the stage for what happened in our election. You cannot understand the Russian meddling in the 2016 election without understanding the Russian response to Ukraine. It was all the same tools. It was the information warfare, essentially, that they had developed in Ukraine, just set loose in the United States. So that was the turning point. Now we can debate the extent of Russian meddling in the election. But we have some evidence. We know that the Russians interfered, right? And we know that it's not a shock. We know that the United States has interfered in everybody's elections for close to 50 years now. So this is nothing new, and that the Russians have their disinformation operations going on throughout the Cold War and since then. So interference in each other's elections, trying to gain intelligence, is not a major development. Although if you turn on MSNBC or CNN, you could see a panel of 4 experts, and all of them saying that Russia's interference was an act of war. Or Hillary Clinton, it's a new Pearl Harbor. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that was used. Not putting this in any perspective, understanding the actual context. One of the more interesting commentaries about it was by George Beebe. I caught this on, I think it was MSNBC. And I taped it and wrote it down. He was a former CIA chief of Russian analysis and an advisor to Dick Cheney. And he said on MSNBC, the evidence out there suggests that Russia was probably involved in some way, but I'm not sure you can reach that judgment with a high degree of confidence based on the evidence we're seeing. He said that it wasn't 17 intelligence agencies, it was 3 intelligence agencies. And of those 3, he said only a handful of hand-picked people were involved in reaching these conclusions. That's not a very normal way of reaching intelligence conclusions. Having a hand-selected small group of individuals from a small number of agencies is irregular. He says it's easy to obscure your identities in conducting these sorts of things. He says it's because the conclusions were partly technical, partly educated guesswork, based on who might have had an interest in doing these sorts of things. He says the Russians were involved probably, but I don't trust the motives that the intelligence community is ascribing to them. He says the IC, intelligence community assessment, indicates that the reason the Russians were involved was simultaneously to help elect Donald Trump on the one hand, but also to undermine our democracy and to undermine what they call the liberal international order. Now, those are very strong statements, and they suggest a policy response on our part that would be designed to fight Russian efforts to destroy us. We haven't examined some alternative hypotheses, which are very important to consider. One is espionage. The Russians have been very active in collecting information through cyber means about our politics, about what might be coming down the road in terms of policy. In the case of these nuclear power plants, our critical infrastructure and vulnerabilities they might be able to take advantage of could serve as deterrents to our own cyber operations against Russia. Also contingencies in the event that we were to find ourselves in a direct military confrontation. The second thing I think we're doing is what you might call simply tit for tat. The Russians believe we've been heavily involved in their domestic politics. We've been active in those areas for many, many years. They've complained about this repeatedly. And I think that one of the things they have is an interest in showing us that they can do the same thing to us that they believe we're doing to them. Since the U.S. government has been involved in Russian domestic politics since well back in the 1990s. The Russians recall very well what we did to support national referendums back in that time. We were actually instructing Russians on how we thought they ought to vote in their national referendums. Absolutely overtly. We were heavily involved in promoting then President Yeltsin's re-election in 1996. So the Russians think we've been knee-deep in Russian domestic politics quite clearly, and they objected to it. So he's saying that, yeah, the Russians interfered, they meddled, and they had good reason to, because we've been doing this to them. Putin, we know, hated Hillary Clinton's orchestrating the demonstration in 2011 that tried to make that election, the parliament elections, look like it was illegitimate, and that his 2012 re-election was going to be illegitimate. We know that in 1996, Yeltsin was polling at 7%. When Clinton told the American authorities, pull out all the stops, do everything we can to get Yeltsin reelected. And we did. In fact, there was a Hollywood movie called Spinning Boris about the open American intervention into the Russian election in 1996. Time magazine wrote cover stories about it. We were proud of this. So in some sense, as Beebe, a Cheney person, is saying, they gave us a taste of our own medicine. And there seems to be evidence that they did so and that they wanted to do so. But now, why do they support Trump? The last three victory days, I brought students to Russia. And last year, I got to bring Jeremy with us also. He didn't quite qualify as a student, but he's a student of Russian history. And we sat down with Alexei Pushkov. Alexei Pushkov was the former head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the lower house of the Parliament. I've gotten to know Alexei pretty well in recent years. I'm regularly on his television show, which is the longest running political talk show in Russia. And Oliver Stone and I met with him, and he met with our group there. And I said to him, either there or the previous time, I said, Alexei, why did you and all the other my other Russian colleagues, all support Trump over Clinton? And Alexei said, Peter, for one reason only. Because Trump said he wanted to be friends with Russia. If we look at Trump as a candidate, now I think Trump is a madman and very, very dangerous and has to be removed from office. But if you go back to his campaign in 2016, 2015, he says that he calls for a new foreign policy that finally learned from the mistakes of the past. He says, we will stop looking to topple regimes and overthrow governments. He said, I'm going to partner with any nation willing to join us in the effort to defeat ISIS and radical Islamic terrorism. In our dealings with other countries, we will seek shared interests wherever possible, pursue a new era of peace, understanding, and goodwill. He says the U.S. policy toward the Middle East has done a tremendous disservice, not only to the Middle East, we've done a tremendous disservice to humanity. The people have been killed, the people have been wiped away, and for what? It's a mess. The Middle East is totally destabilized, a total and complete mess. I wish we had the $4 trillion or $5 trillion. I wish we spent it here in the United States on schools, hospitals, roads, airports, and everything else that are falling apart. I mean, he says we want to live peacefully and in friendship with Russia and China. We know that didn't happen. I would often at these conferences be the only person there, although my Russian saying that as terrible as Hillary Clinton is, and I think she was terrible, the Russians would be much better off dealing with somebody who's somewhat rational, somewhat stable, somewhat predictable, even though a warmonger, than they are dealing with Trump. And it took about a month before that was the headlines coming out of the Russian media, that they made a mistake, and that Trump was a disaster. Well, look what Trump has done. And he's totally fucked up America's relations with Russia in terms of the sanctions, in terms of all the diplomats who were thrown out, in terms of sending lethal aid to Ukraine, across the board. We can talk about that in a few minutes. So the situation has gotten much worse. And even worse than Trump, of course, are the people around him. Initially, you had Mattis and Tillerson, who were trying to restrain him on Iran. Mattis, you might recall, was forced to take early retirement by Obama because he was such a hawk on Iran. In the Trump administration, he was considered the dumb. He was the one who was considered the restraint upon Trump. And Tillerson, when Trump got rid of Tillerson, he said, he was a pain in my ass. All he kept on trying to do was restrain me on Iran. And so he replaced him with Pompeo and Bolton. I don't have to tell you about these people, you know them, but they are nightmares. As Der Spiegel said, Der Spiegel commented that there's hardly a crisis in the world that John Bolton doesn't feel can be solved by war. He was the one who took pride in blowing up the Korean nuclear deal from 1994 to 2002. He said he used the supposed uranium enrichment as the hammer to destroy the deal. He said it was that the deal, he said the Iran treaty was an unprecedented act of surrender. The North Koreans called Bolton human scum and a bloodsucker. And I don't always often agree with the North Koreans, but they're right. I mean, that's a perfect characterization of Bolton. And Pompeo represents the same thing, just a more